Thank you. Yeah, I'm riffing a little bit on the super famous frontispiece of Hobbes' Leviathan, which was actually a book about artificial intelligence written in the 1600s. Hobbes was very concerned about the fact that he's seen civil war, pestilence and the plague and all the bad things happening. And he realized we need a way of aligning each other. And his suggestion was, of course, we will build an artificial intelligence. And he's literally saying that we humans are good at imitating nature. We can take the mechanism in nature and make our own versions of it, like springs, like pneumatics. And we can construct artificial persons that can do stuff for us. In this case, the artificial person was the state. So on that famous frontispiece, you see a city and behind it towers a gigantic person made out of citizens. And at the top there is a head, and that's the king, because he was a royalist and he believed that you need to have a sovereign monarch. And he argued that, well, that monarch maybe is oppressive, but it still beats war and anarchy. Of course, we have come up with other heads, other artificial people, other forms of states that actually work pretty well. And this is a little book project that I've been working on over the last few years. It kind of got in sideways in between the Grand Futures book, because this might be a bit more urgent. And it kind of began with this question of how do we humans get peace and prosperity? And it's hard because we're stupid. We're very stupid. And the stupidity both means that we do the wrong choices, but we're also a bit selfish. So we do things that are good for us, but bad for the group. And quite often that is long-term detrimental for us too. So we tend to be a little bit too short-sighted. How do we solve that? Well, we create institutions. We create a lot of culture. We tell our kids stories about how it's important to be friendly and work together, and that bullies, you need to stand up to them and not support them. You need to take one and wait for the marshmallows, and so on. We build these structures. And because we have a cumulative culture, we're great at building up this enormous complex set of structures that also shape our behavior. So one of the interesting philosophical questions is, where does normativity come from? Why do we think we ought to be doing things? This book is written from a perspective that ethics isn't real. That one of the authors believe that is true. I actually disagree. But we certainly feel in our guts that some things are wrong to do. If you see a queue, most of us feel bad about queue jumping. And queues are also really good at defending themselves. Every September in Oxford, where at my local bus stop, we're standing there in a very British queue. And then the Italian students show up, and they don't know how to queue properly. But by this time of year, we're all standing there in the queue in the rain, including the Italians. Why? Well, we have been frowning at them a little bit. We've been kind of edging our elbows a little bit in their direction. And that is something that has a strong effect on us people. And the end result is that we incorporate the queuing system. And there are different queuing systems in different countries, and they function slightly differently, but solve this coordination problem. So we call these pragmatic epistemic guidelines and precepts. That is, we have an evolution in culture setting up this institution. It starts with small things like queues, but then you get to Hayek and Mises and the wonderful spontaneous orders. We develop these complex systems that we in the book call guides, and they give us peace and prosperity and power to some, and that allows us to do things, but they're also powered by autonomous action. Now, one could say some of them are unfair or don't work very well. Couldn't we design them better? And this is, of course, where we get into the classic debate about centrally planned economies. After all, how hard could it be to run the economy as a linear programming problem? As a first approximation, let's assume everything is linear. The problem is, of course, that actually, even though technically it should be tractable because it's polynomial, it is not tractable in practice. It doesn't work. It also has some serious ethical problems. The interesting thing is this, of course, allows the two of us in the authorship who are kind of liberals to smile at our lefty friend and say, haha, yes, the market wins. And then our lefty co-author says, yeah, but actually I find a bunch of theorems showing that price convergence should take exponential time. Oops, aren't you having the same problem here? And the answer is markets actually empirically work. And that is because we're distributed, we do approximation, we're running on autonomous actions in a distributed computational mode. And this is really interesting, especially once you start thinking about AI and superintelligence. Because if Hayek and Mises were right about the impossibility to outwitting the market, then a superintelligence should never be able to do that, which sounds like a rather bold claim about the limits of superintelligence. So we get into that, and the answer is there are computational limits to superintelligence and supercontrol. But also another interesting realization is that the institutions and firms we have in society are very strongly formed both by the transaction costs and the economies of scale. And they are fairly sensitive to that. So if they change, they might change in size enormously. And AI is very likely to do that. So it might very well be that we reduce the transaction costs and we're all in a world of perfect gig economy, aided by maybe our fiduciary AIs. Or it might be that the economies of scale get so big that we get a planned economy run by Walmart globally, leaving both the socialists and liberals slightly annoyed. The interesting thing here is, of course, as we discussed, when we get better and better AI, then it becomes part of a mediation with the outside world. When we get a cyborg sociality with each other and the world. And when governments and companies get more and more algorithmic, because it's stupid not to make use of these effective systems, we might end up with all these big institutions that are currently collective intelligence run on human brains in a group and pieces of paper get run more and more by software, and eventually completely run by software, which is going to produce so much peace and prosperity, but that human autonomy part is no longer needed, which sounds very, very scary. That's what we call the serfdom conclusion. And what we're trying to look at in this project is, can we actually do that? And I think there is an interesting issue about a second-order alignment problem. The first-order alignment problem is to make an AI that's aligned with you or humanity in the sense that it's not terribly harmful, that it gets what we want and it likes to do that. But the second-order alignment problem is setting up systems that are both aligned but also work with the collective. Because we could end up in a world with perfectly aligned fiduciary AI that is handling everything. But the emergent interaction between our AIs means that the world moves exponentially at an accelerating pace in some random direction set by an interaction matrix nobody has selected. So when we ask our clever AIs, what do we do about it? They say, we don't know. We can't coordinate well enough to do it. So then we're all going off on a wild ride in some mathematical space where we don't know the destination. It's probably not going to be great. But we can also set up AIs to coordinate better, which is really useful against existential risk. And as an ethicist who actually believe that you can have autonomy and virtue, it looks like we might be able to actually construct global coordination that actually makes humanity an autonomous actor, something philosophers say, somebody that is autonomy app, or also virtue app. We might actually use AI coordination to create a civilization that has its act together. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Hi, yeah, super interesting talk. I was wondering, why do you call it second order alignment? Because like, if you think about this world in which there is multiple AIs like interacting to each other, and then like the emerging property comes from the aggregation of all of this, like if the aggregate is not aligned, like it's kind of an alignment problem in the sense that like that's kind of the outcome that we want from the system. Looks like very first order to me.
Yeah, how to distinguish between these levels of alignment? I think there is first order, second order, and third order alignment. The first one is aligning agents with each other. We have that important question, how come we humans are aligned? And we are also doing alignment to each other, trying to make sure that we're safe enough, usually by creating institutions like reputations, like policing, like stories that tell little kids how to behave. And similarly, we want that first order, fairly individual to individual alignment to happen. But then we also have a second order alignment, which we normally talk about as political science. We think about how do we make a government that doesn't come down negatively on the population? How do we ensure that Leviathan is a safe Leviathan? And that is the second order alignment too. The collective AI systems, how do we make them safe for us and allow us to make kind of a niche construction so we can remain in that and flourish as humans. But finally, there's the third order alignment. Do we have tools to align different AI systems and artificial organizations with each other? We might end up in a world where the AIs are treating humans really well. Unfortunately for us, the AIs don't treat each other well. And even if we don't have moral consideration, it might still be a way too turbulent world to live well in. So I think there is a hierarchy of problems. Yeah, but I'm going to write papers about it.